My name is Janelle and I will be reading The Disadvantage. Involvement in Syria will further anti-U.S. sentiment, retaliation, and trigger increased terrorism against the United States and its allies. Point number 1. Attacking an already unstable country will have multiple negative repercussions. Argument 1. Civil wars are particularly resistant to outside solution. Doug Van Dow, Senior Fellowship at the Cato Institute, Huffington Post, posted on September 9th and Access on September 16th. Civil wars are particularly resistant to outside solution. The antagonisms run deep, and there are often multiple parties, none of whom may want peace. In Syria, the radical Islamists appear to be gaining influence. It is not obvious how the same government officials who have made such a mess of other countries could fix Syria. Point 2. Attacking Syria may shift to a worst-case scenario. Brzezinski, political scientist, served as a U.S. National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. Time magazine posted on May 20th and Access on September 16th. The various schemes that have been proposed for a kind of tiddlywinks intervention from around the edges of conflict, no-fly zones, bombing Damascus, and so forth would simply make the situation worse. None of the proposals would result in an outcome strategically beneficial for the U.S. On the contrary, they would produce a more complex, undefined slide into the worst-case scenario. So point 3. If the U.S. attacks Syria, it will bring instability and insecurity to the country. Michael Schenck, Director of Foreign Policy at the Friends Committee of National Legislation, U.S. News, posted on August 27th and Access on September 16th. We've been here before, the haste that comes with invasion. The White House, of every political stripe, inevitably makes the intervention look essential and urgent. We saw this in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, and more. And yet, we are leaving these countries no better off. This liberation language isn't bearing fruit. Just observe the continued escalating violence in Iraq and Afghanistan, the instability in Libya, Yemen, the insecurity in Somalia, and Pakistan. Our approach is all wrong. Our argument 2. Attacking Syria will launch retaliation from Syrian supporters. Assad may be replaced with people that are even worse than he is. Ezra Klein, columnist at The Washington Post and contributor at MSNBC with a bachelor's degree in political science from UCLA, Washington Post, posted on September 5th and Access on September 14th. One reason the United States has been so careful to plan a limited strike is that though Assad is a monster, we're not sure that he'll be replaced by anyone better. Maybe our strikes unexpectedly tip the balance against Assad, but what comes next is chaotic jockeying between moderate and jihadist elements of the opposition, with a dose of revenge killings for good measure. Point B. Syrians will threaten retaliation against the United States. Navia West, partner of the Syrian Free Press Network, nonprofit Syrian-based news organization, August 29th and Access on September 15th. As the U.S. marches towards war with Syria, thousands of Syrians bombarded President Obama's Facebook page with threats of retaliation. Comments from seemingly original profiles represented Syrians from the cities of Homs, Tartus, Damascus, and Aleppo, and more. Warnings of counterattacks from U.S. soil and against Israel were not confined to one photograph or post, but the most disturbing were observed on today's picture honoring Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And 3. Iran and Syria will threaten to retaliate against the United States allies. United Press International, August 29th, and Access on September 9th. Threats of retaliation by Syria's President Bashar Assad and Iran if Syria is attacked should not be taken lightly. Middle East analysts say, both Iran and Syria threaten to strike against Israel and other U.S. allies in the Middle East if there is a U.S. attack on Syria over its alleged use of chemical weapons against its civilians. Our last argument. Terrorist groups will launch an attack and gain control of the chemical weapons. Point 1. Engaging in a war in Syria will give those with anti-American sentiments like the terrorists even more reason to attack the United States. Stephen Zunes, professor of political and international studies at the University of San Francisco and a PhD from Cornell, posted on September 6th and accessed on September 14th. Having the United States once again engaged in a war with a much smaller country on the far side of the world in violation of international legal norms can only strengthen anti-American sentiments and further isolate the U.S. as a rogue superpower, regardless of how horrific the actions of the targeted regime which may have provoked it. Point 2. Terrorists can gain control of chemical weapons in Syria. United Press International top newspapers Source Plus published on January 28th and Access on October 14th. Amid growing fears that Syria's stockpile of unconventional weapons may fall into terrorist hands, Hezbollah set up bases in Syria and Israel, news site said. Hezbollah, listed as a terrorist organization by the United States and other governments, recently set up a number of bases near chemical weapons stockpiles in Syria, possibly in preparation for transfer them to Lebanon, Ynet News said on Monday. And our last point. If terrorist groups can gain control of chemical weapons, they will use it to wipe the United States and Israel off the map. Ted Cruz, Republican Senate in Texas and member of the Armed Services Committee, posted on September 9th and Access on September 11th. Today, the threat is active in Syria, where jihadists have infiltrated the rebel groups. Hezbollah is supporting Assad, making the presence of chemical weapons in Syria ever more perilous. And it is active in Iran, a state sponsor of terrorism that seeks a nuclear bomb to wipe the United States and Israel off the map. If President's proposed military strike against Assad succeeds, al-Qaeda could be strengthened and terrorists could seize control of Syria's vast cache of chemical weapons. I now stand open for cross-examination.
Okay. Hello. Okay, so in your first point, you say that the civil wars are resistant to outside solutions. Do you have any proof that the people that are involved in the Syrian war don't want peace and they don't want intervention?
No.
In your third point, you say that if the U.S. launches an attack, that it will bring instability to the country, right?
Yes.
So does that mean that you consider the current state in Syria to be a stable situation?
No, but we don't want to make it worse. We're going to go in there and just mess it up.
In your second point, in your second argument, in the first point, you say that launching retaliations and it might be replaced by somebody that's worse, but does the affirmative say anything about taking Assad out of control?
Well, it did say that we need to replace Assad. You guys mentioned that he is a monster, and so if we do take him out...
But are we trying to say that we're trying to take him out of power, or we're just trying to strike him?
But it wouldn't strike him ultimately take him out of power, because then, you don't just, slap somebody on the wrist.
So
and
in your third point, your third argument and the third point, you say that if the terrorists do get the weapons, the terrorists can wipe the U.S. off the map, right?
Yes.
But the disadvantage already said that they don't have long-range capabilities, right? So how would they launch attacks against the U.S. if they don't have long-range capabilities?
Well, that's the thing, because we're saying that al-Qaeda and Hezbollah can take over, and there's so many different factions, and then they're all going to come to Syria because they're like, ooh, look, it's all messed up. Let's
but they're
come in
using
there.
the weapons that Syria has,
Well,
and they don't have long-range capabilities, right?
Well, we don't know what that's kind of saying that, they could get control of chemical weapons, and who knows what they bring in it as well.
Okay, but
So
there's
the
no proof. Okay.